Philby was just what he appeared to be, an old drunk. He had no idea that I was a double agent working for the Russians or the British. And the reason that I'm telling this story now is I'm sick to death of hearing how clever the Russians are and how stupid the British are, because that is not the case. It all began 11 years ago when I met some Russian journalists. I wanted a visa for Moscow for my paper, and they introduced me to the Russian embassy in Beirut. So I drove down there one day. After some discussion, managed to get in, where I met the consul, a chap called Victor Zhukov. He asked me to come back once or twice, said the visa was being arranged, and then, out of the blue, he started coming to my house. He began asking questions, nothing about what I would do in Russia, but all the sorts of things that the British were doing in the Middle East. And this began to, oh well, I was getting worried about the whole thing. I was a bit scared of, what if any of my British friends saw me? What if? I got very worried about all this questioning and decided to get rid of this fellow. So I called up a Lebanese friend of mine, and he said, why don't you tell him a complete lie, and it'll put him off. He'll probably report it to Moscow. So that night, I had a brainwave, and I got on the phone to Victor at his private address. Drove down to the airport to have a drink with a friend of mine. While I was there, the airport manager called me up, or came down to see me and said, Harry, come up quickly. I've got something to show you upstairs. So I rushed up to the control tower. He handed me a pair of binoculars. I said, look at that. And there, out at sea, about a mile away, is a great big armada of ships, unloading troops. So I grabbed the binoculars, and I thought, God, it can't be. They've got to be British or French or Japanese or something. And I watched them coming closer and closer until I could see the helmets. I could almost see them chewing gum. It was the American Marines landing in Beirut. Victor came to see me. He said he was delighted with it. He had a message from Russia that the Russian government sent its compliments to me, thanking me for this great scoop that I'd given. Well, I got scared, and I decided to go to the British and tell them about this. I didn't go to the embassy myself. I got a friend of mine to go and tell them about it. And I was given a message back that I was just to hold on and keep talking to Victor. So one day, a letter was pushed under the door. It came from London. I took it into my study there, at my flat, opened it. It came from a very distinguished address, which impressed me immediately, and the letter said that London was very interested in what had happened. And they asked me, would I carry on meeting Victor and make a full report of everything he said. Very, very shortly after that, an agent flew in from London, called me up, introduced himself with the code name of Bart, and we began to have meetings. We had to be very careful about our meetings. We had to choose special rendezvous where it was most unlikely that friends of mine would stumble on me at the last moment and drag me off for a drink somewhere. We'd choose the exact time, the exact type of car, the exact tree sometimes, and the exact second. And I would have to start, let's say, walking a few yards and be picked up. The car would come along, door would open, and I would jump in. And I had to make sure, of course, it was the right car I was jumping in, and not a passing taxi driver. And then we get in the car, and I'd quickly pass on to Bart all the questions which Moscow had asked me to give him. He would go off, get those off to London, get the answers as quickly as possible, which I would in turn then pass on to Victor and then to Moscow. So it was really a correspondence between London and Moscow with me in the middle. And so I became a double agent. Victor used to call every week, every Thursday night, about 6 to 9, and give me a list of questions for Moscow, which then I would pass on to Bart, pass on to London, etc. And I would have to type out a complete report on how Victor behaved, everything else we talked about over the bar, and give back to Victor the following week with the answers rewritten in my style, what I thought the British were doing here and there, etc. I became eventually so well trusted by the Russians that they asked me to set up my own spy ring throughout the Middle East. Well, I did this. It was a complete fake spy ring. They were all my own agents. Every month, I was given a small plain white envelope with my expenses. Each time, it contained exactly the same amount of money, 400 Lebanese pounds, about 50 pounds sterling. But despite the fact that they had made me a rather top agent in the Middle East, the Russians were taking no chances with me. And of course, espionage is built on mistrust. And one day, through the trees from my flat, I was quite horrified to see Victor passing by my gate and going into the house next door. That really gave me a scare, and I knew that I was, no matter what they said about me, how many congratulations I got, I was still and probably always under surveillance by them. And from a little window in the house next door, Victor could see my front place and could see everyone who was coming and going. Suddenly I was dropped by the Russians. It wasn't Victor. It wasn't Philby. It was George Blake, the master spy, who betrayed me to the Russians. And because of that betrayal, he himself was caught by British intelligence, arrested, taken back and put in prison. Meanwhile, Philby was drinking himself stupid. I used to have a drink with him quite often in this place, in the bar of the Hotel St. George. He always drank in the Normandy. But one day, British intelligence found out that he was asking questions about the information I'd given to the Russians. So they knew right away he was back to his old tricks. They flew agents from London. They told them they were going to pick him up and they had to defect. From the Normandy hotel, he made his phone call to the Russian embassy. They told him to wait 10 minutes. He had another drink. The Zim, bulletproof Zim, which is still outside my flat, drove up outside the door. He went through the revolving doors, into the Zim, made the short trip down to Beirut port. Diplomatic plates straight through the docks onto a Russian freighter which was there. 2 hours later, the freighter went off and Philby had defected. What did I achieve as a double agent? Well, I fooled the Russians for 15 months, fed them a lot of phony information. They'll never know if it was what was true and what was false. I was also responsible through my work for the capture of George Blake, the master spy, and the exposure of Philby, the master traitor. I'm glad it's all over now. It was a very harassing period, very frightening at times. And even now, when I cross the streets, I look very carefully to right and left, because one never knows in this business of the double agent when someone will catch up with you. You never know when the dossier has been closed and you'll be forgotten.